please help me welcome Dr. Spofford and Dr. Pearson for today's presentation entitled The Legendary Doll Test and Two Black Psychologists Who Changed History.
Well, thank you, Colleen, for that. I guess we are mic'd, right?
We are.
You can hear me okay? Great. Thank you for that introduction. Very flattering. I wish I could maybe measure up to half of it, but thanks. I think we're going to start with some pictures here. And this is my recent book, What the Children Told Us. And the cover is kind of different, a little odd. It's a biography of a married couple, psychologists, Drs. Kenneth and Mamie Clark. And what's unusual about this cover for a biography is they're not on it. And so why is that? Well, that's because publishers are smarter than writers. And they said, you know, this doll test is really famous. More famous than they are. In their day, they were very famous. But let's get that on that cover. And they had focus groups and so on. And the focus group said, hey, this is the cover. So this is the cover. But now these pictures, I'm going to give you the couple and their people. The Phipps family and the Clark family. Who were their people? What is their story? Where do they come from? Okay, so and then Megan and I are going to have a little Q&A session here, and you'll be able to join in too with your own questions. Here's Dr. Kenneth and Mamie Clark. This is sometime probably in the late 40s, and they're quite young, and already maybe at this point, maybe Kenneth is as much as 33, 34, and Mamie is around 30. And already they've accomplished much of what has already ensured their fame. At this point, they have founded a psychiatric center for children in Harlem, emotionally disturbed children, called the Northside Center for Child Development. And they made it from scratch. They got their friends who were psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, and so on to pitch in and give their time for free and start this. So they've already done that at this point. They both finished their degrees, PhDs in psychology at Columbia University, one of the best schools in the nation for that particular field at that time. They have already raised 2 children. I'll give you some more on that later with a picture of Mamie with their 2 babies. So she's quite an extraordinary person who managed to get her doctorate in just 4 years. I think today the average is maybe 7, 8 years to complete a doctorate. And while giving birth, while breastfeeding, washing diapers, and so on. Quite a remarkable woman, really. So these are our heroes. They have not yet engaged with Thurgood Marshall to do the testimony that they gave for the Brown versus Board of Education case, which really ensured their fate. They testified in these federal trials in 3 different states. And I failed to mention at this point, they even did the doll test already. That's in their past already. And when this picture is taken, they don't know that Thurgood Marshall is going to come to them and say, hey, how about helping me in these trials? And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court the Supreme Court does not have trials. They have oral arguments. So there are actually lawyers arguing over the doll test. And the Clarks were sitting there in the audience watching this. Okay, so here we're going to go into Mamie's family first. These are her people. So Mamie is from Hot Springs, Arkansas, And these are her parents. This is Doc Phipps and her mother, Katie, in front of their home, 302 Garden Street in Hot Springs. And pardon me, I have asthma, so occasionally I will do what I'm doing right now, choking. If I turn blue, then get worried, but otherwise I'll make it. They're standing in front of their home, which kind of doubled as an elite B&B at the time, an inn. Doc Phipps was not only a doctor, but he also was a hotelier. Now, that might seem like a strange dual career track, but it's not so strange if you understand segregation in the South at that time. It was hard for a doctor or a lawyer to make a living because Black people back then especially earned so very little. But so he's running a hotel, and it's not just to make money. The hotel doubles as a hospital. The hotel does that. It's a what they used to call back then I'm trying to remember what the word is now. It'll come to me in a minute. But anyway, the hotel offers bathhouses. The waters, which they at the time thought were curative, they were kind of medicine, would course through the geothermal springs of the city and into these hotels and bathhouses. So the hotels had these great big tubs, and people would come in. Strangely enough, they might have syphilis. That was a really common disease. And the bath attendants would rub mercury on their limbs to cure it, as horrifying as that sounds, because mercury is poisonous. And Black bath attendants did that all the time throughout the town in these bathhouses. Okay, so there are white bathhouses and Black bathhouses, white hotels and Black hotels, and even the white hotels had these bathhouses also. People from all over the country flocked to Hot Springs for the cure, to get better, and that included Black people. Lots of Black people, many of them quite celebrated, famous, and moneyed. But many people in town, not so moneyed, but nonetheless, they had jobs as bath attendants, and they earned a reasonable buck and got reasonably okay tips. Not that there was never any hardship, because there was plenty of that to go around. Okay, back then there were no ambulances. White hospitals just turned all Black patients away. There was no health system for Black people, period, and nobody worried about it. Okay, so this is Doc Phipps when he's a young man. This is in the Caribbean. He was an immigrant. He came from St. Kitts. That's his mom. And I'm not really sure when this picture was taken. He may have just finished his college degree. I'm not sure. He went to Meekin College in Jamaica, got his degree, became a school teacher and school principal. Apparently got rather bored doing that and said, hey, let's go to America and become a doctor and make a whole pile of money. So he got on a ship with $160 in his wallet and went to America, tried to find his father. His father eventually found him, and his father pretty much slammed the door in his face. Didn't want anything to do with helping him through medical school. But Doc Phipps worked a number of jobs, including as a Pullman porter, which was a kind of the Black Pullman porters had pretty much a monopoly on that trade. And that's what he did, and eventually earned enough money to pay his way through Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee. And he hanged his shingle in Hot Springs because this was the town with these fabled springs where all kinds of pilgrims, ailing pilgrims, tourists came for the water cure. And also there was all kinds of things going on in that town, zoos. I had zoos, shooting galleries, casinos, bars, some cases with White Lightning that they sold, moonshine. It was a really wide open, rollicking town. And believe it or not, they had spring training for Major League Baseball. Teams like the Pittsburgh Pirates played there, several different teams over the years. They had a big racetrack. It was a resort, particularly for Chicagoans. But even Stephen Crane, the great novelist of the 19th century, wrote about Hot Springs and what a cool place it was to visit. And that is in his journalism. Okay, so now we're still on Mamie's family. These are her grandparents. So we're going back a generation. and her mom, Mamie's mom, is that very young lady up there sitting next to her father. And her grandfather, her father, Mamie Clark's grandfather is that gentleman with a handlebar mustache. And he had been enslaved in Virginia before the Civil War. And he was a bath attendant, worked in the Arlington Hotel. It still stands. I stayed there this spring, and it's quite an opulent, great big hotel. And it has bathtubs, big. It has a bathhouse even today. So it has a bath, these great big tubs of water. And Mamie, his wife, Mamie Johnson Smith, our Mamie Clark's grandmother and namesake, that's where she got the name Mamie from, she married Jesse, who was a 41-year-old man when she was just 19. And she gave him these three children, and one of them is not hers, and I'll explain that in a minute. But she was college educated, and she graduated, well, for a time she went to Fisk in Nashville, but then she got her degree at Roger Williams University, a historically black institution in Nashville. The little boy there looks perhaps like a white boy, is not. That's something white people actually need to get to realize, is that's not uncommon for certain black people to be able to virtually pass as white, and he could. That's Alfred, and he became a rather famous man in his own right. He became a member of FDR's famous Black Cabinet in Washington, and at the very same time, he was an activist. He was a black activist who would leak news, information, vital information to the NAACP, the Urban League, and he had a column in black newspapers, starting with the Chicago Defender, but then syndicated to other black papers, in which basically he more or less criticized the very administration he worked for, because if you think the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration was pro-black, it was not. The Democratic Party was the racist party of its era. It was the party of the Solid South. The Republican Party was regarded as the party of Lincoln, and for many black people, that was their party. FDR helped change that. He reached out, and not too much, not too directly, because he needed black votes. He wanted black votes, and he got them by consenting to hiring a number of black advisors, like that little boy, that blonde boy there, Alfred. Henry is the teenager there on the right of his dad, and Henry is kind of an interesting proof that the very best families, the most successful, the families like this one that value education and black activism and other such things don't always produce perfect results every time. Henry was given money for groceries one day, and he skipped town with the grocery money. stayed away quite a while, came back sometime later. I can't tell you how much later. And his sister back there, Katie, our Mamie Clark's mom, gave him a home, gave him a job, and he rewarded her by stealing the hotel silver and skipping town again. So now that little boy there with the belt unstrapped a little bit, his name is Shepherd Acre, and he was it's not clear exactly who he was, a cousin, or in any case, the family had taken him in, which was very common back then, and even today, very often a distant relative or just a friend, a neighborhood child in need, black families would take them in. Okay, this is now we're switching over to the other side, the other clan, the Clarks. And this is the Clarks of Cologne, Panama. Kenneth Clark's granddad is that gentleman with the, I think you can see the boutonniere and looks like a pocket watch maybe. He's the elder gentleman, and that's his grandfather, Walter, and he was a supervisor on the docks of Cologne. At the time Kenneth was born, 1914, the Panama Canal had just opened for a trial run that week. The first ship had gone through. And the reason Cologne, Panama was anything more than just a little trading post in the jungle is that it was where most of the material came in from the United States to build that canal. It was right on the Caribbean Sea, and it went all the way to the Pacific, to the other side, Panama City. Now, that gentleman in the back row on the right with the boutonniere, he is Arthurton Clark, and that is the gentleman who became Kenneth Clark's father. And he, too, became, like his father, a supervisor on the docks of Cologne. You can tell this is a solid middle-class family by the standards of Cologne, Panama at that time. They had a nice big Victorian house. They had a great big porch like Victorians often have, and the kids would roller skate on it. And how do I know that? Because one of the young men here, his name was Rupert Clark. I interviewed him. He was 96 years old and had a memory clear as a bell. And I'll never forget the day I interviewed him, because that 96-year-old man who stood about 6'5", thin as a rail, healthy, I just couldn't believe it. He got down and on his knees, went under a bed, and pulled out this picture for me. Okay. Now, this is Kenneth. He emigrated to America. His mother beat him to it. She went 2 years ahead of him to New York City, settled in Harlem, got a job as a seamstress in the garment district, and separated from her husband. Her husband didn't want to go to America because he told her it was a racist nation and no way a black man could make it in America. He'd never get a good middle-class supervisory position on the docks in New York City the way he had there. And I have no doubt that he was right about that, because New York City's economy was completely, the job market was totally segregated. And I think he was right about that. So Kenneth came with his grandmother, Grandma B, through Ellis Island, and he used this passport to go with his grandmother after being in America for a couple of years. He came through Ellis at about 6 years old. But in a year or two from that, he went to, it was a family tradition, he went to Jamaica for a year to study in the British, a rather rigorous and rigid education system. That was something that family did. Panama was a Spanish-speaking nation. The schools were, the lessons were conducted in Spanish, and that family the people that you just saw in the prior picture, those boys and girls lived in Jamaica for a time and got a taste of a British education. Okay, this is Kenneth when he's maybe 12, 13, and he took a shine to art, loved art. I wanted to show this for two reasons. One is, notice that each one of these productions of his, these masks, represents a person of a different race, ethnicity, and occupation. Pretty interesting. He was interested in different kinds of people. That's the way America was, New York City was back then. Harlem was integrated. I know it's hard to believe. Back then, the whites outnumbered black people, and really Hispanics weren't terribly well represented back then. Irish. Harlem was mostly Irish and Jewish back then. So I think this is kind of interesting also because he loved art and was frustrated that he didn't become a good artist. He wanted to be one. And he befriended lots of artists who in many cases, gave him their work. And his collection at the end of his life of African art and African-American art was appraised at $4.3 million. He was very friendly with Romare Bearden, the great Jacob Lawrence, one of my favorite artists, and Charles Pinky Alston. This is his mother, the most really crucial person in forming his personality. This is Miriam Clark, born in Jamaica. Our parents moved to Panama to get jobs that were one way or another, indirectly or directly related to the Panama Canal construction. Miriam was quite a person. She was a seamstress. She was a shop steward in the Garment Workers Union. She was regarded as having great judgment. So in a mostly white workplace, she was the shop steward. She was the union person that you would go to for help. And she would negotiate for people. They were paid by piecework. So many mills, which, believe it or not, I'm old enough to remember seeing mills, and a mill was a fraction of a penny. And so there would be negotiating that she would do with the bosses to make sure every worker got paid for every stitch, every button, every buttonhole that they made. This picture was taken in Hastings, New York. Kenneth lived the first 30 years of his life in Harlem. Mamie lived with him after they married from 1938 to 1950 in Harlem. But they moved to this suburban Hastings-on-Hudson, Westchester County home. And he posed for this picture with his mom. He truly, truly loved her. And she had, through her hard work, she paid his way through college and his sister's way through as well. No loans back then. This is Kenneth doing the doll test. And I'll just give you a thumbnail. What is the doll test? And this picture, which was taken by Gordon Parks, and this is another one in that series right here by the great Gordon Parks, the black photographer. Gordon Parks not only was noted for his wonderful photographs, and by the way, these photographs often turn up in museums today. They're really classics. And they were published first in Albany magazine because Kenneth was helping Mamie get this thing up, this psychiatric center up and running, and he wanted to promote it, get people to come, and Gordon Parks helped him. He did the photo shoot for a series of articles in Albany, July 1947. And this picture simulates a doll test where a black child would typically be asked, here are these two dolls, one brown, one white. Which one do you want to play with? Which one's your favorite? Which one's the good one? And which one is the bad one? Always the last question. Which one looks like you? And the majority of children and this was only black children, rejected the black doll and embraced the white doll. And so it was about 2/3 did that. And some of those children denied they were black, and some of those children used pejorative language to describe the brown doll. And this test is conducted around the world, even today and across the nation. So it's a really pretty historic test. This is Mamie during World War II. This is her with her baby Hilton on her lap. She is about to finish her PhD in psychology after giving birth to this baby. And Kate, her daughter, is there on the left. And Kate, by the way, Hilton helped a little too, but Kate gave me enormous help in writing this book. She threw open her garage to me and let me see things like that wonderful passport photo of Kenneth that you saw a little while ago when he was 9 years old. That photograph was sitting on the top of a teetering pile of boxes in Osprey, Florida, and she let me in there and gave me the run of the place for 3 days. And I took my digital camera and I clicked away for hours and hours and hours, and it really helped write this book. Her mother, Katie, is the woman you see there sitting on the settee on the porch, and apparently she's visiting a friend. The Clarks went back to Hot Springs all the time in the summer. They'd leave their children weeks at a time. They wanted them to have a flavor of what was life in segregated Hot Springs and to know and love, revere the Phipps's, Mamie's parents. This is my last picture. This is the Clarks near retirement. Mamie's near retirement. Kenneth has just retired. He retired from teaching for part of 4 decades at City College of New York, teaching psychology. He also retired because he did both. He was running the first black think tank in America, the Metropolitan Applied Research Center, and it was a think tank to generate research and policy papers to help inform public debate and government policy having to do with race relations and civil rights. So they set up this executive consulting firm. Mamie at this point is still running Northside Center, right? She ran that for, again, 4 decades. And she's about to retire in a year or so from this time this picture was taken. And there's Kate, her daughter, on the right, and that's Hilton. That's the little baby that she was bouncing on her lap a minute ago in that picture you just saw. And what did this executive consulting firm do? It worked on affirmative action policy, minority hiring, recruiting, retention, and conflict, being able to resolve conflicts between employer-employees and between employees also, racial conflict in particular. So now you know who they are, and we can get to the best part of this, thanks to Meg.
Thank you for those wonderful images. And really, the book is such a complete picture of the history of this couple and sort of what they accomplished. But so much of the importance of what the Clarks have done has to do...
I won't run away, promise.
I just make a run for the door. So much of what they accomplished has to be seen in the perspective of the history of America in the 40s, and that involves segregation, which you touched on a bit with the pictures. Can you expound upon that a bit more to sort of set context for our students?
Sure, thank you. A big thing to know is that this couple worked like hell to integrate schools, and we're still fighting over that. If you remember the last presidential election, Kamala Harris buttonholed Joe Biden and said, yeah, Joe, you were a senator from Delaware, and you were really against school integration. And that became a real hot issue for a couple days. It's still an issue. But what they were trying to do was to help the NAACP destroy segregated schooling. So what was school segregation like in the 40s and 50s? Pretty awful. Far more awful than almost anybody really realizes. That urban areas had a black high school in the Deep South. That's true, but they were separate and completely unequal schools. They had usually in the urban areas they had flush toilets and they had water fountains, but they didn't have playing fields and gyms and chem labs and auto mechanics shop and things like that some of the white urban schools had. But in the rural areas, that was the worst thing. Most black people before 1950 lived south of the Mason-Dixon line, and they lived in rural areas. And the rural areas rarely had a black high school. They had a high school, but that was not for black people. They were not allowed in. So the schools that were there were usually just grade schools, and they were rickety, wooden structures, often, and I hate to say it, like tar paper shacks. Black families in many communities had to buy their own land. They used Rosenwald Fund. This was a Jewish man, a philanthropist who'd run the Sears Roebuck retail establishment. Rosenwald gave seed money to build schools, so they would take some of that money and build these little structures. But typically they had pot-bellied stoves. Yeah, and this is 1954. I'm 4 years old at that time, so I'm alive. This was going on in my own lifetime. And pot-bellied stoves, and the children would be encouraged, they'd be tasked with sitting near the pot-bellied stove, and if a coal came out on the wooden floor, and this happened with some regularity, your job was to take a pair of tongs, pick up the coal, throw it back into the pot-bellied stove. Outhouses, no flush toilets, and perhaps a bucket of water on the front step somewhere, and with a dipper, and that was your water fountain. The white high school in town, this would have all the obvious modern conveniences, including central heating, not air conditioning, but central heating. And so that is the reality that they were fighting. And fortunately, once the Clarks and Thurgood Marshall and others, this was a huge effort of a lot of people, began fighting in federal courts to integrate those schools. What happened is the South suddenly discovered money that didn't know it had. Started building schools, brick schools, decent schools, but still segregated. So that was at least the first step toward a better society, and the Clarks played a significant role in that development. Other types of segregation, well, I've already told you about housing. Not housing, hospitals, but housing segregation. Well, neighborhoods, oddly in the South, they tended to be interlocked. You'd often have a white neighborhood, but you would have a separate black neighborhood around the corner or just across the street. And the black people would be expected to maybe be waiters and cooks and laundresses and so on in those white houses. But there was a rigid segregation, even though in close proximity. That was the South. In the North, completely different. Once more and more black people came into Harlem, more and more white people began leaving. And so Kenneth, and it happened very rapidly, Kenneth went to school in Harlem Elementary School, and the schools were mostly white and totally integrated. Quite a few Jewish and black students, either from the islands like he was, the Caribbean, or from the South to flee lynching and the most brutal form of segregation you can imagine. So by the time he got into high school, the schools were really almost entirely all black in Harlem. The grade schools. The high school was in Washington Heights, George Washington.
So speaking of education, your time here at Plattsburgh, you've mentioned, has really impacted the trajectory of your own research and the topics you wanted to look into. So can you share a bit about your experience here at Plattsburgh in the 60s?
Yes. Well, yeah, I graduated in 71, but mostly I think of it as going through the 60s. I don't think the 60s really ended in 1969 at midnight. But yeah, I came in 67, and I was 17 years old, and I was in my psych class in Hawkins Hall, class with about 250 intro to psychology students, virtually all of us freshmen. Loved the course, loved the professor. He was terrific. A very attractive young man with red hair, and he told the story of Kenneth Clark and the doll test. And so that's how I found out about it. And I guess I have reporter's genes, and I remembered that name, never forgot it. And I thought the story about the doll test was horrifying, and couldn't shake it, couldn't forget it. But I was also very interested in journalism and current events. I avidly read the New York Times, loved that paper, and Kenneth frankly read its space on the front page, so you'd see him all the time on the front page. And even he wrote for the he wrote essays for the magazine section occasionally in the 60s. And that was how I followed his career. And then I, after teaching for several years, many years, I became a journalist in Albany, the capital, covering education, and a great job, which I love, because that's where education policy for the state is made. And Kenneth Clark, this guy, was on the Board of Regents, so he was basically helping to call the shots, but he was in the minority. In the 1970s, school integration was a hot topic, and increasingly the Board of Regents was being packed with conservatives that were hostile to integrated schools. So they were against using busing for the purposes of achieving integration. He fought them like hell, and he wasn't terribly diplomatic about it. And he basically ratted them out in the front page of the New York Times on a pretty regular basis, called for closing the New York City, to relieve the New York City School Board of control over New York City schools because of their dereliction of duty, the failure to support policies like busing and so on. He even testified against the Board of Regents that he served on in a lawsuit in Buffalo. So I one day walked into I covered the Regents. I covered the SUNY system. SUNY Central, the headquarters are located there. So I covered all those board meetings. But one of my most interesting experiences was interviewing Kenneth and seeing him in operation in the Board of Regents chamber, and a room, a really august, high-ceiling room, like granite walls, I think it was, and pictures of two famous, pictures of several regents, all white, but two rather historical figures, John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. You might have heard of him. And there was this little round-shouldered, frail, elderly man, 71 years old, speaking very softly and low, and everybody's hanging on his every word. Everybody bowing and scraping to him because he was walking history. He was the most famous black scholar in America at that time, the most prominent by far. And so I interviewed him, and I said to him, I want to express my condolences, the passing of your wife. And he said to me, and this is just before we started the interview, put his hand over his stomach, and he said, "Oh, I feel like I've lost an organ." And at that moment, I realized that, these are historic personages. No one's written this book. I should do that. And here we are, many years later.
I think you touched on one of the most important things that I loved about this book. Of course, the Dahl test led to the trials that led to Brown versus Board of Education, right? This massive historical impact. But the book is much more, it's just as interested in the relationship between this couple and the world. What made that choice happen for you? Why focus on the relationship between Mamie and Kenneth as much as Brown versus Board of Education?
Well, I really wanted to tell their story. And because I knew they had such an important role in it, but also they were such a quirky couple. They're never two more different people end up in a marriage together. You just couldn't believe it. Kenneth was a hopeless a procrastinator, and Mamie was punctual to a fault almost. She was very, very on target. She was a great manager, great administrator. He was horrible, terrible. He was the visionary, though. He was the visionary. He was the idea guy. He came up with all the great ideas. Unfortunately, she would often bear the burden of carrying them out. On time, I might add, with the Dahl test. If not for Mamie, you never would have heard of it. I wouldn't be sitting here. He did the testing because she was pregnant for their first child, and so they were very, very young. And she did all the tabulations for the testing, page after page after page, intricate analysis of all the kids' answers, broken down by gender, by skin color, shade of the skin, by geography, because they started the testing in not too far from here, Springfield, Massachusetts, and they ended in nominally integrated school district, and they ended in Hot Springs. Also did a little bit in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and Little Rock, Arkansas, to get enough children in the sample that they needed. But in any case, she compiled all that data, broke it down, and wrote an outline and wrote a report to the Rosenwald Fund, which funded the study. Neither one of them could get jobs. They both had PhDs. They had a hell of a time getting a job because New York was a very segregated city, a very segregated state, not as strictly and severely as Arkansas and the Deep South was, but still very segregated. The job market was totally segregated. It took years for both of them to land professional jobs. So Mamie really is the crucial factor in this. And it was a great combination. She made up for his weaknesses and he made up for her weaknesses. And her great, great weakness was she was deathly afraid of doing what I'm doing right now, public speaking, deathly afraid. And she had a phobia. And so he often was her advance man, her PR man for their psych center. He's the one that got the press out. He was the one who got all the attention. He was like the ambassador of the world for that clinic, and Mamie was the one who got it up and operating and kept it solvent, because Kenneth could never have done that. And by the way, she was so smart and so organized. That institution still exists. Kenneth founded a lot of institutions, and they all crumbled pretty soon. But she was the manager, and she said, damn it, this is going to continue. And it did.
I love that. I love the focus on her. Time is speeding away from us. So I wanted to make sure we had a few moments for any questions anyone might have. Yes.
I was surprised to hear that the Dahl test is still being conducted. Please tell me the results are due.
They are somewhat different. back then, 2/3 of the children answered, black children answered that they wanted the white doll to play with, and about 60% had negative, really solidly rejected the brown doll. But by around 69, 70, in that area, some of the results were changing. You had the Black Power movement, the Black Pride movement, encouraged by Malcolm X. You had the Black Arts movement, whole cultural flowering, especially in Harlem. And as a result, you had an awful lot of a buoying of Black pride, Black identity, because this is what they were doing. The Clarks opened up a whole field that didn't exist before, racial identity studies. They still continue. I mean, they still exist. And their test has been done in, that I know of, Ghana, Italy, Union of South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Trinidad and Tobago, and that's as many as I know about. I'm sure there are other nations as well, and all across the United States. And did I mention, I don't think I did, the 2 boxes in the Library of Congress of their papers? There are 500 boxes, almost 500. The 2 boxes that deal with the doll test are among the most requested in the Library of Congress Rare Book and Documents Division, because people are so fascinated by it. And it's not just adults or scholars. A lot of times it's kids. Kids go, and there was a young lady, Carrie Davis, very, very young, and I think she was in high school. She did her own little doll test with encouragement from her mother, and it was filmed, and she interviewed her fellow students about how they felt about things like black hair, black skin color, and so on, and she filmed children taking a doll test, and several of black children rejected the black doll still, and it's on her little film, which you can find. It's on YouTube. Kiri Davis, Kiri Davis. But if you do the doll test, Google doll test, and you will find it. It's there.
That's astonishing.
Anderson Cooper, right after Obama got elected, there were a lot of journalists. I remember Gwen Ifill talking about it on Washington Week in Review, and I remember Chris Matthews on MSNBC speculating at the time, gee, I wonder if now we have a black president, if the doll test results will change. So Anderson Cooper spent a whole week on it, and he had 2 scholars who were working on a study of these children, filmed it, and so on. White children were included. Today, usually white children are also tested, and those results are really pretty disturbing, because those white children very often are, little kids are pretty candid. I mean, they don't play the adult game. Oh, I'm not a racist. I'm going to just come right on and say, no, I want the white doll. Why don't you want this brown doll? Because it's black. I don't want a black doll, and really pretty chilling. And sometimes, saying some other things that really made their parents who are on camera feel really uncomfortable. So, and Cooper did this twice. He did it in, I believe it was 2012 and 2014, and had 2 different panels of scholars working on it. So this is a big deal. And by the way, the doll industry today, always, it's not a question just a bunch of white people, probably men, making a decision in a conference room about what black dolls are going to look like. No, there's a whole lot of consultation with black scholars, community members, parents, and so on about the design of dolls today, so they do not offend people of color. And we thank the Clarks for that.
It's the influence they have keeps rolling and rolling
That's right.
forward.
That's right.
So powerful.
A scholar who did her dissertation on the doll test on Long Island. Was it Long Island University? No. I'm forgetting the school. Any case, she was hired by Mattel or something to help design dolls. I mean, her yeah, yes. I mean, her judgment was used.
Yeah.
And this is the Clark's impact on our popular culture. There were 3 movies made about this. One was Separate But Equal with Sidney Poitier, you might have heard of him, and another another called Simple Justice. Simple Justice, the guy who played Kenneth Clark was, oh geez, am I going to blank out on that name? An Italian name. Yeah, I guess I'm going to blank out. Senior moment here. But he's famous. You would recognize his name. So
Powerful. I know we have
yeah, forget Thurgood. There's it was a stage play on Broadway, and it's a one-man play with originally Larry Fishburne playing Thurgood Marshall, and he reenacts the doll test. He makes believe he's Kenneth Clark conducting the doll test, and that was filmed by HBO. And I've seen it a couple times.
Yeah, I remember when that came out. That's great. I want to make sure we have a chance to thank our distinguished guest here, and then you have the opportunity to purchase one of his books outside, signed by Tim Spofford himself, alumnus of SUNY Plattsburgh. So please join me in thanking our guest,